November 22nd, 1991, Garden Lodge, London. Brian May stood in the hallway outside Freddie Mercury's bedroom door, a cup of tea going cold in his hand, listening to the particular quality of silence that came from a room where someone was resting rather than sleeping. He had learned across these final months to tell the difference. Resting meant Freddie could still be reached. Sleeping meant the visit would have to wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes until the following day. Brian set the tea down on the hallway table, untouched, and knocked once. Softly, the specific rhythm Freddie had once joked was Brian's own private signature. 3 fingers, evenly spaced, like a chord voicing. A voice answered from inside, thin but unmistakably Freddie's, telling him to come in before he'd even finished raising his hand for the second knock. And Brian would say later, in the handful of interviews where this particular evening has come up in any detail, that something in the speed of that answer told him Freddie had been waiting specifically for him, not simply willing to receive whoever happened to visit next. Brian pushed the door open and found the room arranged the way it had been arranged every day for weeks now. Curtains drawn against the low autumn light, a single lamp burning beside the bed. The specific hush of a space that had been organized entirely around comfort rather than any pretense of normal domestic life. Freddie was propped against his pillows in the configuration that had become standard, and Brian has described, across his limited accounts of this evening, a particular quality in Freddie's eyes that struck him immediately, an alertness that exceeded what his physical condition would have predicted. The same specific and hard-won clarity Brian had learned to recognize as meaning Freddie had. Something prepared, something he had been holding on to and waiting for the right moment to say. Brian settled into his usual chair, the one that had, across the preceding months, become almost entirely his own within the small rotation of people who sat beside that bed. And Freddie's first words were not a greeting, but a question, delivered, according to Brian's account, with a directness that skipped past the ordinary preamble of their recent visits. "Do you know what I've been thinking about all afternoon, Brian?" Freddie asked, and before Brian could answer, Freddie continued, his voice thin, but carrying the specific rhythmic quality that had once filled stadiums. "I've been thinking about what happens to a song after the person who wrote it can't sing it anymore. Whether it just stops existing, or whether it keeps existing because somebody else is willing to carry it." Brian has said, across the interviews addressing this conversation, that he understood immediately this was not an abstract or philosophical question, that Freddie was building towards something specific. And he has described sitting very still, letting Freddie continue at whatever pace his strength allowed, rather than filling the silence with reassurance the way he might have with a less deliberate conversation. Freddie talked, according to Brian's account, about the band's earliest years, the cramped rehearsal rooms, the years of playing for audiences who barely acknowledged them, and he framed this history, according to Brian's characterization, not as nostalgia, but as evidence, building toward a specific argument he wanted Brian to fully understand before he arrived at whatever request the conversation was actually organized around. "You built half of what people think is mine," Freddie said, according to the version of this line Brian has offered with the most consistency. "That guitar sound, that's not an accident I happened to sing over. You made an instrument out of a fireplace and a bicycle and pure stubbornness, and then you made it sound like it had always existed, like it was inevitable. Roger built the engine underneath everything. The 3 of you were never just backing me. You were the reason I had somewhere to stand." Brian has described trying to deflect this at the time, offering the kind of modest correction that had characterized their working relationship across 2 decades. And Freddie, according to Brian's account, cut him off with a firmness that Brian found almost startling given how little physical strength remained available to produce it. "Don't," Freddie said. "Don't do the humble thing right now. I don't have the energy to argue you out of it, and I need you to actually hear this instead of deflecting it the way you always do." Brian has said this specific moment, being told directly and without room for his usual self-effacement exactly how essential his contribution had been, carried a weight he did not fully process until much later. Understanding only in retrospect that Freddie had been laying careful groundwork, establishing a foundation of fact before building toward the actual request the conversation existed to deliver. Freddie continued, according to Brian's account, addressing the band's future with a specificity that suggested considerable private thought had gone into exactly what he wanted to say. Acknowledging that his own illness had already begun limiting what the four of them, three of them by that point in any practical sense, could still accomplish together, and moving from that acknowledgement toward what Brian has described as the conversation's actual center. "When I'm gone, people are going to want to close the book," Freddie said, according to Brian's account of this central portion of the conversation. "They're going to want Queen to become a museum piece, something you visit and admire and leave exactly as you found it. And some of that is fine, some of that is even right. There are things that shouldn't continue. There are configurations that only worked because all four of us were standing in exactly the right places. But I need you to promise me something, and I need you to actually promise it, not just nod at me the way you're nodding right now." Brian has said he stopped nodding immediately, a detail he has offered with a small, rueful laugh in at least one interview, understanding that Freddie had caught him in exactly the kind of passive listening Freddie was trying to prevent. And he has described leaning forward instead, giving Freddie his full and undivided attention in the specific way the moment clearly demanded. Freddie's request, when it finally arrived, was direct. "I need you to keep it loud," he said. "Not tribute loud, not memorial loud, not the sad, respectful kind of loud that happens at funerals when everyone's trying to be careful with each other. I need you to keep Queen loud the way we always were, brash and ridiculous and too much, because that's the only kind of remembering that actually honors what we built. If you make it quiet, if you make it careful, you'll be burying it twice." Brian has described asking, in the moment, whether Freddie meant he wanted the band to continue performing after his death. A question Brian has said he asked carefully, aware of how strange and painful the subject matter genuinely was for both of them, and Freddie's answer, according to Brian's account, addressed this directly rather than deflecting into vagueness. "I'm not saying replace me," Freddie said. "Nobody's replacing me, and anyone who tries is an idiot who doesn't understand what made this work in the first place. But the songs don't belong only to me. They never did. Roger wrote as much of this catalog as I did. You wrote We Will Rock You on a stage with your foot, for God's sake. If you three want to keep playing them, if you want to find someone who can stand at that microphone and understand that they're not trying to be me, they're trying to serve the songs the way I always tried to serve them, then you have my blessing, completely, without reservation. What you don't have my blessing to do is stop, out of some idea that stopping is more respectful than continuing. Stopping isn't respect. Stopping is just fear wearing respect as a costume." Brian has said this specific framing, the distinction between genuine respect and fear disguised as respect, became something he returned to repeatedly across the following 2 decades, particularly during the periods when the band faced public criticism for continuing to tour and record without Freddie, understanding those decisions. Whenever doubt crept in, through the specific lens Freddie had offered him on that November evening, the conversation shifted, according to Brian's account, towards something more practical, Freddie offering specific thoughts about which unfinished material from their recent recording sessions he felt strongly should eventually see release, and which pieces he felt should remain private. A distinction Brian has said Freddie articulated with considerable clarity despite his evident physical exhaustion, as though this particular portion of the conversation had been rehearsed internally many times before Brian actually arrived that evening. Brian has described taking mental notes rather than physical ones, understanding instinctively that writing anything down in that specific moment would have introduced a formality that neither of them wanted. That this conversation needed to remain exactly what it was: two friends talking in a dim bedroom rather than a business meeting being minuted for later reference. Freddie's energy, according to Brian's account, began visibly diminishing as the conversation approached what would prove to be its final stretch, his voice thinning further, his sentences growing shorter. Though Brian has said the clarity and directness that had characterized the entire exchange never fully receded, Freddie apparently determined to finish exactly what he had started, regardless of the physical cost. "One more thing," Freddie said, according to Brian's account of the conversation's closing moments, "and then I need to rest, because I've used up today's allowance of being interesting." Brian has described laughing, despite everything, at this specific characteristic flash of humor, arriving even in the conversation's most exhausted final minutes, a detail he has cited across several interviews as exactly the kind of thing that made Freddie impossible to fully prepare for even after 20 years of friendship. "Whatever happens," Freddie continued, "however it feels in the moment, however much the world wants to make this into a tragedy, I need you to remember that we won. 4 kids who had no business succeeding at any of this, we actually did it. We made the whole world sing along to songs we wrote in bedsits and vans and terrible rehearsal spaces. That's not a tragedy ending, Brian. That's a triumph with a difficult final chapter. Don't let anyone, including yourself, rewrite it into something smaller than it actually was." Brian has said he took Freddie's hand at this point, according to his own account, and that neither man spoke again for what felt like a considerable stretch of time. The conversation's practical content fully delivered and received, both of them simply sitting together in the specific quiet that follows something important finally being said aloud. Freddie Mercury died 2 days later, on the 24th of November 1991, and Brian has said, across the more than 3 decades since, that he thought of this particular conversation constantly during the difficult and often publicly contested years that followed. The band's decision to continue recording and eventually touring, first with various guest vocalists, and eventually in the long-running partnership with Adam Lambert that has, since 2011, brought Queen's music to entirely new generations of audiences. Brian has cited this November evening specifically, in several separate interviews, addressing the criticism the band occasionally faced for continuing without Freddie, as the source of whatever confidence allowed him to proceed despite that criticism, understanding, each time doubt surfaced, that he was not defying Freddie's memory, but actively fulfilling an instruction Freddie had delivered to him directly, deliberately, 2 days before his death, with a clarity that left considerably less room for interpretation than the broader public conversation about. Queen's legacy has often assumed. What makes this particular account meaningful within the larger context of Freddie Mercury's final days is not simply its content, but its specific contrast with the quieter, more private conversations he apparently held with other members of his closest circle during this same general period, each calibrated, according to the broader pattern of testimony from these final weeks, to the specific person receiving it and the specific role Freddie understood that person would need to occupy in whatever came next. For Brian, that role was not permission to step back. It was instruction to keep playing, loudly, unapologetically, for as long as there remained anyone left willing to listen, because silence, however respectful it might have looked from the outside, was never what Freddie Mercury actually wanted left behind in his place.